Hey, Elaine, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Would you mind just letting our listeners know who you are and what you do?
I'm Alane Boyd, as we just said, but we started calling ourselves Workday Ninjas. I own a software company and automation services company. And it's to go into companies and we help them automate their processes. So going from manual to automated to help make things consistent, make them streamlined, and get a break.
I think that's a hot topic right now, especially for small business owners. Like everyone knows they need automation, but not everybody knows exactly where to start or what processes to automate first. Number one, could you tell us kind of how you, number one, became passionate about automating and like what you see are the biggest needs in the market to go out and automate and create process?
Yeah, I got to this point. So, previous to this company, I had a social media marketing agency and software company. And we got acquired. We had about 125 employees. We ran it off of Asana, the project management system. And what I realized is it really didn't matter what we were doing for work. It was the fact that we did it with so few people and how much work we were producing. And when we got acquired, the company was like, "We want you to stay on for 18 months for your buyout and you have to put your systems in place. We need what you did." And so I was so naive. I mean, I was really young. I finished my 18 months when I was 34 years old. So I built that company through my 20s and early 30s. And what I realized going through that is that what I built was special, using operations, using processes. And after I sold, I was super bored in retirement. And I just thought maybe I could do some consulting, and maybe there's some other businesses out there that need my help. And quickly realized that is my special sauce, seeing things, making it a well oiled machine. And so then I started building this company in retirement.
Awesome. And what would you say the biggest struggle is for the people that you work with when it comes to starting to automate? What is the roadblock or the obstacle to go from that like manual work to fully automated or maybe even not fully automated?
Yeah. And sometimes it may not, like you said, it may not need to be fully automated, but to at least document the process. And we see that so often. And sometimes it's because you're in it every day that you can't see the end result of what that could look like. And so the first thing we do when we work with a company is we do a process map. What does your process actually look like? And we get the key people a part of it because so many times the processes are in different people's heads. So they have one piece here, one piece here. So one of the things that you need to do to start off with is actually document your process using pen and paper or Google Docs or something like Lucid Chart or Miro. Like, get those pieces in there. What does your process look like? And then you can start identifying, okay, well, this is software talking to each other. We could automate this piece, this handoff from here to here.
Yeah. And I find that now I have a process improvement background myself too. So I nerd out on this stuff all the time. And I also find that like when you're documenting a process, my advice is typically document the best case scenario of how it's supposed to go because there's always going to be these little spikes and branches that come out with decision trees of, well, if it doesn't work that way, what happens? And if somebody doesn't respond, what happens? And if something breaks down, what happens? I say like automate as much as you can the flow of how it's supposed to go, but then you have to have those kind of contingency plans in your process of when the process goes sideways and things fall off.
Yeah, and like you're saying, like when you have that starting place to work from, the fires start to diminish too of how many things you have to focus on. So then you can really start branching and focusing on, okay, well, if it doesn't work perfectly, then what needs to happen over here? Like
Yeah.
clients get upset. Maybe it can't follow the path that you have. So you need to have, okay, well, if it goes this way, this is how it works.
Yeah. We connect this all the time too. I speak very frequently on this podcast and in general about building a valuable business. And you lived that by actually being able to exit a business, quite young, I would say, in the grand scheme of things. And part of it was because you had built the machine. You had built the processes. I can't tell you how many people I know who are agency owners who do not have a sellable business because a lot of that stuff is in their heads. Talk to me about how, in going through that experience of your exit, the role that those processes played, because I really want people to understand the case study of why they should be thinking about this and the impact that it can have.
So whenever we were determined that we wanted to sell, We had already put systems in place because we were burnt out. I mean, my co-founder and I we were working all the time. Our employees were burnt out. So we put the systems in place to survive. And then what happens when you're starting to go through selling your company is that you get shopped. There's companies that look at you and they do their due diligence. And there's been times, not for my company, but for others, where they get in and it's spaghetti. We call it spaghetti. There's just chaos everywhere. And
Yep.
the excitement to get bought starts to dwindle by a company because they're like, that's a disaster. We're not taking on a disaster. And so you have to be at a point, if you want to get to the finish line, you want to be as polished as possible. And even though you're doing it for that exit, look at it for doing it for your sanity. The more you get out of your head or your employees' heads, the more sustainable you are if somebody leaves. You're not
Absolutely
trying
true.
to, a lot of times it's your time that gets absorbed when you're hiring somebody new if you're a small business. That your time's the most valuable in the company. And so, you could think of it, okay, well, I do want to get bought one day and have that as like the reason to get motivated. But in the background, like, man, you actually might build a company you love and don't need to exit it either.
Yeah, I actually just went to a workshop where they talked about this and said if you're building a company, and it's kind of like when you're trying to sell a house. And when you're about to sell your house, what do? You repaint everything, you clean the house, you put away all the crap that was in the closets, and you're like, you know what? I actually like this house. It's actually really nice to live in because I've made it attractive to a buyer. And
Mhm.
I'm also a buyer. I'm still making a buying decision to stay or to leave. So when you look around and say, hey, this actually ain't so bad, I've cleaned it up now. We say a house worth living in is one worth selling, and vice versa. A house that's ready to sell is a house that's ready to live in. Same with a business. It's a business ready to sell is one worth keeping too.
I love that analogy. That is the perfect comparison because you do get to the point where I'm not working all the time. I am paying
Yep.
myself more money because I have a team that's knowledgeable, they can get things done, and my clients are happier. So, that time period that I mentioned where I had to stay on for 18 months, we saw the lifetime value of clients increase by 20% just in that 18 months. They stayed on 20% longer. Then their employees went from staying on average for 6 months to they were still there when we left. That is a
Yeah.
huge difference. You're not always training new employees and burning out the ones that you were keeping. That really affects your bottom line for your company.
Totally. And we're talking about LTV of clients, which is lifetime value, guys. LTV for clients is a function of the duration the clients stay, which you just mentioned, but also how much they spend with you
Yeah.
and how the value that you can provide them and the prices you can charge them. So, in a way, we found this too as well with project management is that we can deliver much more value by systematizing the product and basically refining the recipe of what we do really clearly so we can do more of it faster and with more efficiency and better quality. So now we can A, sell more clients, but also B, we can deliver value faster to the clients we have, therefore increasing lifetime value by being able to increase prices or having them upsell into other services. So it goes both ways where like there's really no downside to building processes. People say it's time consuming, but I find it to be a really big investment of the time because it does pay dividends in the future. Do you agree?
Oh my gosh, yeah. And that is such a good point too, as when you're going to start building your processes, it does feel overwhelming because you're looking at everything in your company. And it doesn't need to be where you start day one and build everything, every process in your company. It can be, I just got asked this question and I'm going to build an SOP on it. And you build naturally. And if you have more than just you and your company, that doesn't have to just be you creating the process. That could be your other managers, your other admins, and you can just do it a little bit more reactively. And you're constantly building.
Yeah, we started with anything that required escalation. So, like anything that the team wasn't instinctively resolving. So, anything where guidance was needed from me was the first thing to free up my time for answering questions. And then the team beyond that would then take that and say, well, I'm going to add that into my SOP of what I do. But they took full ownership because they knew their process back in front to then write down what they were doing. And actually, what was interesting as an exercise is having your team write their own SOP and not you write it for them because you can find the gap. of what they're actually doing, like how they describe what they actually do versus how you kind of designed it in your head and thought you were playing that game of telephone with them and telling them what to do. That
Hmm.
when you train them, it's like, oh, the process has morphed into this now. And now you're aware of that because even though you're seeing the same outcome, now you're really aware of like how they actually go about it and how they approach it. And you can find even more efficiencies and train them through, hey, I noticed that you're doing it A way, but I was thinking you were doing it B way, which is way faster. Can I show you what I was talking about? We've actually found a ton of opportunities to kind of reconcile those things as we go through the process as well.
Yeah, and that's such a more proactive way of doing it than reactive when they go on vacation for a week and you realize how many gaps are and you're kind of scrambling to fix things.
Yeah, or like you're not going to break their habit by making an SOP telling them to do something different. You have to really kind of get into the weeds with it and say like why are they doing it this way? What is the path of least resistance? And even though you're designing the way theoretically it should work, that may not match the practical way that it actually does work in the
Mhm.
real world or account for the obstacles and the objections that they face. So it's actually kind of a fun exercise. I think it's fun because I'm a nerd about this, but it's a fun exercise to go through to just tackle it piece by piece. We said, month by month, we would kind of focus on a process. So, like, you don't have to do it all in one day,
Mhm.
all in one setting. We started with client onboarding and kind of talked through. I actually voice noted a whole story about how I want the client onboarding to go. My team took that, transcribed it, put it in ChatGPT to like bullet point the process that Shannon just dictated. And then they basically criticized all of it and said, like, we're not currently doing this. This would take too much energy. Like, I basically said, poke holes in the process. Tell me what's wrong
Mhm.
with it. And let's figure out what the new version of this is going to be. But it helped it to keep everyone involved and committed to this is what the process is going to be.
Yeah, and you're using technology to make it easy for you, like taking that
Right.
transcript and put it in Chat GPT or whatever AI you use and say, hey, take this transcript and write the step-by-step process. You just saved yourself half an hour's worth of work trying to listen and type that process out. Technology
Yeah.
does it in seconds.
That and I'm a verbal processor, hence podcaster. I'm a verbal processor who's way more inclined to just send an hour-long voice note explaining everything in my brain while I'm going on a walk, as opposed to sitting in front of a computer and trying to create a linear flow and then going back and forth and refocusing and kind of context switching constantly. I can't do it. I can't stay focused and write for that amount of time. So you have to find a way that works for you. And I love that technology enables us to do that a little bit easier. Even those tools where they actually record your screen or they're actually, following along with the process, it's crazy what you can accomplish a lot faster now.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, it's amazing. I wish I had these tools in my previous company when I had so much more happening and things, but you know what, it is what it is. Technology
Yeah.
evolves and luckily we get to evolve with it.
Yeah. I think that almost anyone listening would agree that we need more standardized processes, more structure, more organization of these processes. You know, do you have any kind of blanket advice on where to get started in your journey or in your processing or process documents and what to kind of do to start the process going? Because like I said, it's overwhelming, it's a lot of stuff, it's a lot of different moving pieces, and it's kind of that analysis paralysis of this feels like a huge heavy lift, I really don't want to do it, and I'm not really sure where to start or how much time to spend on it. Do you have any recommendations on how to implement this for someone who is just really struggling with that kind of limiting mindset on it?
Yeah. I think the core piece, and for my company, the core piece is a project management system in place. Because from there, you can create a template, a task with subtasks on it, and people can follow it. You can check it off. So always think this is the first piece, and that is the core that I'm looking for when we bring clients on. Okay, do they want a project management system, or do they have one, or do they want one? Then that's a good client for us. But I think that's the first step is to have something to put all of these standard operating procedures, all of these things in place is to have that core system. So Asana, Monday, ClickUp, there's so many out there that you can choose from. And if it's okay to say too, it's hard to know which one to go with. I've tried them all, which one should I use? If you go to my website, workdayninja.com, there's a free tool and you just put in what's important to you. You answer 12 questions and it'll actually tell you which project management system would be a best fit. So I always think that's the first place to start. And then what I like to do, and when we're working with clients, is shoot a Loom video, which is very similar to you doing an audio clip. Shoot a Loom and take that transcript. It already has the transcript for you. So shoot a Loom, you can record your screen on the steps, then put it into ChatGPT, that transcript, and have it write out the process. And then save it in your project management system, or if you have a separate knowledge based system, save it there. Let that be the resource. And you have to train yourself to not verbally answer a question. So many people, they get slacked or teamed and get asked, and then they'll just answer it instead of sending the person to the knowledge base document. So instead, you're still the knowledge base. So it's kind of breaking your habit too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, people say that it takes a lot of time to do this, but I say, I'm telling you on the other side of it, how much time it will save you in the questions, because it will be the first line of defense people will go to establish the how, like the questions that are more transactional, the how, the procedural tasks. You really don't want to be bothered with those as the founder. You really don't. You don't want to find like, hey, Shannon, how do I edit this on the website? Ugh, I I don't want to have to explain all that and have to show it to you. I'm willing to, but it's not something where I want to context switch and have to go do that. Anything that is Googleable, right? Or anything, and we can actually just shorten the time frame it takes for someone to learn the how behind something so they can get things done faster and feel more successful at the end of the day. I think it's just an enabler to make people feel more successful faster and be like, got it done without hitting any roadblocks along the way.
Yeah. And kind of like thinking through what an exit would look like. If you don't, then you are your company. If you can't leave your day or for a month and your company can't run without you, then you're your company. And an exit will look like you getting hired to do a job at an exit.
Yes.
If you do sell your company, you are going to have to stay on because you are too important to it.
Absolutely. And because you're too important to it, you've just signed yourself up for working for your own company with no control. And that's
Yes.
even worse, in my opinion. Like, I left corporate to go build something better and do it my way. And I go, kind of my nightmare is someone taking over and telling me to do it differently if I have to be around when someone else takes over. It's just very strange. It's like living in the house analogy, right? It's like the house buyer, but you stay in your bedroom and they're going to
And you rent.
redecorate, and you rent, and they're going to redecorate, and you're going to be like, oh my God, like, what are they doing to
Now I
my
have to
house?
live here.
And now I
Yes.
have to live here and watch it happen. And I know several people who have exited and had to stick around through an earn out or buyout situation. And it sounds fine when you're starting it, but it's an indicator that they still need you around to ask you questions and that they still feel like you're a component of the business of what they bought. And it's a sign that you may be too attached to your business. You may be too closely associated with it, or there might be too much up here in your brain that they purchased and they have to
Hmm.
extract it out over time, as opposed to somebody who has that all extracted onto an Asana board or something like that, which we also use. That is, you can hand that over and be like, here's all the IP, like, here's all
Hmm.
the recipes. There's no like grandma's recipe that I do from scratch in my head. It's all written out on the recipe cards here. There's nothing I'm hiding. And
Yes.
while that can be scary to be like, oh my God, all my secrets are down here. And I think that's also a mindset thing too of, well, if all of it's out in the project management system, I'm easily replaceable. And while that may be a compliment to some of us, that's not a good thing. Can you just talk through anybody who's negatively associating the fact, oh, I'm replaceable, I'm not special anymore? Talk about that, like associating value with how much you're keeping up here.
I had a hard time with that early on, and I call it hero syndrome. Like I wanted to be the hero. And it took me until my business partner just was like, I need you over here and you keep coming over here. And it was a huge wake up call for me. And we already had a ton of systems in place, but there were things that I didn't want to let go of that I felt like I couldn't. And so it wasn't a fear of being replaced, but it was a fear of not being helpful and not being the hero, that ego feed. And I
Mm-hmm.
had to learn that's not what I'm there for. And that took me about a year. And I was able to, like, it took me a while to get the pieces in place because I did have so much knowledge. So I had to overcome that feeling. And on the other side, if you're a founder doing that with your employees, and the idea is you don't want them to feel like they're replaceable, right? Like you want them to be long term there. You only want to let them go because they're not a good fit. You don't want them to quit on you. And so what the best feeling that I had was when somebody had put in their notice and they said, I can stay as long as you want. I said, you can leave tomorrow because I already had everything documented. I could replace them so easily because everything was already there. So for a founder, that's what I want. I don't want to hold on to people and be, oh my God, I'm losing this person. I never want them to feel like they're replaceable, but I want them to be replaceable. And, the way that we started to paint the picture for employees, the best transition is people got to leave work at the end of their day. They didn't have to answer emails at 9 p.m. or on the weekends, and they're working all the time. That they've, it felt a little bit scary at first, for a lot of different reasons. Maybe they felt replaceable, maybe they had hero syndrome too for those managers. But when they started seeing it where they could take a break, and when I got acquired, and those managers, they were fighting me tooth and nail about putting these systems in place, feeling like the customer value was going to be gone. And I'm like, it's going to be the opposite, guys. Just do this with me. Stay on board. And I promise you, it feels rough in the beginning, but we're going to get better. And within 2 weeks, they were raving champions of what we were putting in place. And so, we let those voices in our head tell us these negative thoughts, but really it is a positive for everybody because everybody wants to leave work. They have real lives. We want life to be greater than work.
Absolutely. So when it comes to actually implementing these processes into your business, I think people get really overwhelmed at, again, the size and magnitude of what they have to do. And like you said, we have to start with just chipping away at it bit by bit. Can you give us some examples of ways people have approached this successfully that you've worked with or that you've seen in the marketplace, right? And saying, okay, Shannon did it this way, right? Like my voice note thing. It's like, that's one way to do it. There's no right or wrong way, as long as it ends up with a process. There's no really right or wrong way to get there. But what are some of the ways that have worked for you so that the person listening right now can go, oh, I didn't think of doing it that way. I could do that a lot easier than the way I think I have to do it with some massive Google Sheet or Google Doc.
Yeah. And you mentioned client onboarding. That's the number one process that companies want to, because we have clients, right? So that's what we're focused on. So what that can look like is creating a list. So that could be you with a piece of paper, just creating a list. What is everything that needs to get done to onboard a client? It could be, I really like going into Lucid Chart and building out a process map and using the boxes and arrows, color coding it based on, what team is this supposed to be associated with? Because new client onboarding crosses multiple teams. You have the sales team conversating with your account management team, that's going to your admin team, that's creating maybe Dropbox folders or Drive folders or whatever. And so I like to color code things, which team does this sit with? And using Lucid Chart, like a mind map almost. Or it could be a checklist, like I mentioned, and going into Google Docs. Okay, like let's just make a list. What is everything that needs to happen? And you can put in parentheses which team that needs to have happen. I like to go into my project management system and create a rough template of what I think needs to happen, and then get some other eyes on it, because I'm not associated with every single thing anymore. So I don't have all the knowledge. So I do like to get other input. So, finding some people really like using as another one and just kind of like word dumping into it and making a list. And so you could do it a few different ways to just get the pieces down on paper, literally,
Yeah.
or in technology.
Yeah. Or another way too is like the next time it happens, kind of having that, I say, break the fourth wall, like watch yourself do it and write down what you're doing along the way so that you're
Yeah.
not spending extra time in like fabricating this scenario, but like you're actually living it. It's like write down what you're doing as you're doing it, kind of
Hmm.
checking off the boxes in a sense of what's in your notebook that you have to do. It's like you already have that to-do list. You just have to transfer that into something that's easily shareable or that people can update and edit. I think that people overestimate how long this takes because they think, oh, I have to go and like, dump out all the stuff that's in my brain. I said, well, you could just like document what you're doing as you're doing it. Just turn
Hmm.
on Loom while you're doing your thing and then realize like all the fingerprints and footprints you're leaving behind in that process. And then just have that consume the process and have it watch you. And then you can also share that with other employees too and say, here's me doing it. I actually done that. And the employee, this is also the mark of a really good employee. The employee was like, I don't like how you do that. You can do it better. I'm going to show you. And you also have to, again, leave your ego at the door and be like, please show
Yeah.
me how to do this better. Because I think once you have it clear on how you do it and it's super clearly documented, then other people can then poke holes in it and say, hey, I actually have a better way to do that.
Yeah. Man, do I love smarter people than me that I hired. Like, I
Yeah.
have let go of needing to be the smartest person because if they can figure it out a better way, that's exactly who I want on my team. And I
Yep.
can give, I did that this morning, exactly what you said, where I needed to go create something, but I wanted my team to be able to execute it. And I recorded me for 20 minutes going through what I wanted them to do, training them and send that over to them. Now, hopefully they know a better way. I'm fingers crossed they haven't watched it yet. But I think, like you said, we have to leave our egos at the door because at the end of the day, we don't want to be the only person coming up with good ideas.
Hmm. And getting into the real tactics of documenting a process, a lesson I've learned too is like how much detail you have to have. Could you speak to kind of that sweet spot of level of detail, like if you've seen something work or not work? Because I know that my tendency is to, I think I'm being detailed, and then you pass it off to somebody else, and like you said, to click the button and it's like, which button? There are actually three buttons. It's not being super clear where someone could follow it. So like what is your like level of detail where I feel like there are diminishing returns with too much detail sometimes, but what's your take on it when it comes to documenting and trying to make it as detailed as possible at the risk of over engineering it?
Well, I had to learn that I had to explain it like they're five. For
Mm.
somebody that has no context to a process, that especially if they're a new employee, they're coming on board and they're green, meaning that maybe they're in a entry level position, they have no context. I had to be very specific. And our SOPs would have screenshots with arrows to which button needed to be clicked, how to write it, all of those things. Now, when you get into higher level management where they've got more skills, you don't have to be as specific with things. They can maybe not read between the lines, but like they can figure out which button to click. They're but that's a more experienced worker, right? They've got this context. So I found with the entry level positions, you got to be very specific, and then it might be the steps that need to be specific and not how it gets done necessarily. Like send the welcome email. Well, you could have an email template that they use and they can put their own customizations in that. Give them some, leeway with how the conversation goes, but the core message is the same with every new client. So like here's the main structure, you can customize it how you want.
Yeah, I think that when you give the structure, you give the template, but you also give a little room for the personalization that is the sweet spot. Because if you make it too mechanical, people will start to kind of mentally distance themselves from the task and make it more mechanical themselves and then be more prone to error. I
Yeah.
found that myself where I say, like, use the template, and they use the template verbatim. And I'm like, well, I wanted you to put in, like, when it says bracket first name, I want you to actually
They're good.
right there for, like, you know what I mean? Like, really read it and understand why we're doing it. And the biggest thing I found with process documentation was if someone does not understand why they are doing the thing and where it fits into a broader process, you're set up for failure. 100%.
I mean, you just nailed it. And one of we come into companies and do this for companies, right? So our team, and I'm not a solution expert, I am not the best person, so my team is for solutioning how software can talk and reading API docs and things. And what we have in our process, we have a template that each account manager fills out when they talk with the client what needs to be implemented. We record a video of the goal of the client so that the person building it has context. Because just like there's a million languages to say hello in, technology can be built in 50 different ways. And so we just need the end result communicated in that context. So we always, even if we write, we have to write it out, and we have like, what's the goal of the client? What assets do we need? And we record a video and put it in with that test so the team has the context on why they're doing it and they can figure out how to do it.
Yeah. And context is everything, but it's not just like the processes on each side of what they're doing, or like what car of the train you're on. It's like, where the hell is the train going? And knowing that this is the destination of why we're all here, I think that also imposes the judgment that they need. We had this thing, I kind of not made this up, but I realized that I couldn't possibly triage every single possible question someone could ask me about a customer when they say, how do I respond to X type of request? I realized that the more I dictated and specifically wrote responses, I said, I'm going to have to write 200,000 of these because there's so many varieties of the question. So, one thing that we always struggled with when we were building the process was I looked at what was the biggest time suck for me. And for me, it was answering questions, these ad hoc questions that clients would pile on. I mean, I'm an accountant, right? So I'm getting a ton of questions around tax time. And I'm like, how could I make this more efficient? Now, this is pre AI, by the way, because everyone's going to be like, oh, make a chat bot. No, I know. But until we get to that point with technology, right? What are the ways I can train my team to triage this for me and then create an escalation path instead, where I'm
Mhm.
getting the tougher questions, but the easy questions are handled by the team? I think that's a great place to start because it also teaches them. The problem is I didn't have 200,000 different answers to different questions because there was so much variety in how they could answer those. So I implemented something I called guiding principles to be like, what are the key components you need to have in your response, and make sure that you're at least giving them a response. Even if you don't have the full answer and you need to escalate to me, let them know like what you do know, make them feel seen, heard, and understood. Let them know you're going to go talk to Shannon and that the timeline on when you're going to respond, or ask if there's any urgency to the response. Hey, when do you need to know this by? I'll let Shannon know. And it goes a long way when you can just give the guidelines and let people operate within those guidelines as opposed to trying to over dictate exactly how to do stuff. Do you agree?
Oh gosh, yeah. And there are so many gems that you just said, like finding out the urgency from the client. Like account managers often feel like everything's urgent, right? Because they want to take care of their clients. And we had to train that with our team too. Even now, it's like they might need something, but they're just asking. Like it doesn't mean that it's urgent for them. So asking like, hey, is it okay if I get this to you on Monday? Or, when do you need it by? Those guiding principles that you mentioned, that is genius. I love that. And I never had that idea, which I want to implement. I think it's brilliant. But I have core things on training on how to write an email, not using certain words or certain phrases that have a negative connotation, because you're immediately putting that client in a defensive situation. And so, that's how I had to start training. Okay, did you follow these guidelines here? But I like the positive side that you added to it with your guidelines, like, seen, heard, listened to, all those things. And then, are we answering their question? A lot of times I see account managers, when they don't know, they try to fluff and just be wordy. And I'm like, cut it by 50%. If you don't know, you don't know. That's okay. But you need to
Yeah.
say that and that you're going to find out an answer. Don't just add words to fill white space.
Yeah, and don't
So
try to be smarter. Don't try to sound smarter. It just makes you more confusing,
yeah,
in my opinion.
so many times I'm like, look at your email, cut it by 50%. I say that all the time. And that's one of the trainings that I have now is look at your words, cut it by 50%, because nobody wants to read all that. Be concise. And, so I have these kind of guidelines, like, are you being concise? Are you using negative words? And really leaving out, let me know at the end of an email. Let me know. Mm, That is like the worst. Just end
Yeah.
your email. They
We
know
could have
they're
a
going to let
whole
you know.
we could have a whole episode on that, like best practices on the communication side of things too. But yeah, I think when you have a process like that though, you have to unpack some of those preferences because that's not common sense. So if we take that, right, and go, that's not common sense. Most people will say, let me know. But if you say, hey, we don't say that at the end of emails, like we really just stick with like address the question, acknowledge that it was a good question, give the steps that you're going to take next, establish the timeline. and then give them a call to action or a timeline to follow up with you or something, right? So it's kind
Mhm.
of like frameworking the thing instead of saying, here is the scripted response to this. You don't have to create all these scripts. You don't have to create the word for word verbatim stuff. You can just create the structure that you want or the elements.
Mhm. Yeah, and having some resources too. So, maybe they do ask questions and maybe writing the email needs to like I love that structure you just outlined. But you could always link to other resources. So like one thing we used to always get asked was about Yelp reviews. I don't know if you know about Yelp reviews,
Yep.
but a portion of them get hidden in a filter. And so we always get emails about why their 5-star reviews aren't showing and they're just disappearing. And so we had a link that like to a blog article basically explaining that they could link to, but then they could still write an email with that customer is frustrated. We need to meet them where they are and not just be like, well, you're wrong. They're not removed from your page, so like let's have some compassion and empathy because it does suck that this happens, have a resource for them. And then, hey, you know what? We have some best practices we could talk about on our next planning call on how to overcome this. Everything doesn't have to also be unpacked in an email. It can have other resources. You can plan it ahead of time. You don't have to put out that fire right now.
Yeah. And, I want to wrap up on this note, which is like standardization and customization. I think that people assume that in order to have processes in place, I must standardize everything and basically make the same recipe for all of my customers. And it's my personal belief that's not true. I want to hear your thoughts on that. Like the standardization of the processes and how important that is versus building in like customization for everybody.
Yeah. And I love that you're bringing this up. It really then, what I had to learn the hard way is the person I'm hiring, because a person can follow that process perfectly to a T and still do poorly in that job because they are the wrong fit. And I had a lady that worked for me, and she worked so hard and she followed every process, but the clients did not like her. And even though but that's where customization comes in. You have a standard process that you need to then have somebody that is the right fit for that role be able to take it and run with it. Because we all have different skill sets. If you put me in a data entry position, there will be mistakes. I will be bored out of my mind finding everything else to do other than that, and I'm just not the right fit for that role. So that's where I think like if you're hiring for somebody doing stuff client facing, make sure they have a social personality, somebody that has some charisma to them. And then they can look at that standard process, follow it, and have their own little customizations in there so that because they know their clients' personalities, and they can act appropriately in that conversation.
Yeah. And actually, I have a little case study on this too, because we implemented a process where, let's say, a client doesn't respond to a request. We have an escalation and a follow up process of like send them a Slack, send them an email, send them a phone call or text message, right? And I just wrote, send them a communication based on their preference.
Mhm.
And we send a Slack first. And if that doesn't get a response, my team kind of then like, when you hit like that wall, like that one like little toy that just keeps hitting the wall and hitting the wall, they kept
Yeah.
hitting a wall because they kept slacking the person. And I said, evidently they're not checking Slack. These are not non-responsive people. This is probably a technology barrier where they're just like not getting the alert.
Yeah.
So here's what you're going to do. Go back to their profile because we collect this information on intake. Go back to their profile and find out their preferred communication method. So if it's call them, hey, number one, I just had a quick question for you. Number two, could you check your Slack messages and make sure your notifications are turned on? That's the primary way that we tend to get in touch with people for first line requests. We don't call everybody, but we just want to make sure that you're going to see those requests. Lo and behold, notifications were turned off. Now it's not a problem anymore. But they were saying this person's non responsive. I said, no, the method is ineffective. And
Right.
that's a different problem. And you have to be able to delineate those two things. And I say the standardization is we use Slack for all client communications. I said, but you have to leave room for the wait a second, who is that person? What do they prefer? How do they prefer to be interacted with? And how do we meet them where they're at? Because what's more important is the outcome, not how we got there. The more
Yes.
important thing is how we got responded to or how we got the information we needed as fast as possible. And if the quickest path to that is their preferred communication, like just pick up the phone and call me. Then I say,
Yeah.
cool, pick up the phone and call them. They don't have to make them adapt to our communication style. We can meet them where they're at too. And you have to leave room for that.
Gosh, I love that. And we create a client brief for every new client that comes
Yep.
on, and that's included in their time zone. We don't want to,
Yep.
if if you're in Eastern time zone and they're in Pacific, you don't want to send them a text at 5 a.m. So, these little things that, and especially during the handoff from sales to account management, that client brief is gold, because then the client doesn't have to repeat anything for the account manager. Those kind of details are already there. Where are the key team members? There's so many people that are located around the country now. They're not always in the same office. So you might have three key people in three different time zones. And when we work with corporate clients don't want to be texted. They prefer being emailed because they're in front of their desk, they're working, they may not be on their phone, or that's not a work phone. So they don't want to be texted on their personal phone about things. So like getting that information is so important, and having it in a client brief, or, whatever document you want to call it, associated with that client.
Yeah. And when we build the process around it, we don't have to dictate the method. That's the
Mhm.
key thing, is like you don't have to dictate to that level of detail. You can say, go look at what time zone they're in, go look at what their preferred communication method is. Because you know what? People need to be told that,
Yeah.
because it's not instinctive to go check the recipient's information. It's instinctive to communicate the way we want to send a message, not the
Yeah.
way someone wants to receive it. So yes, that has to be in the SOP. And I have to remind people constantly of, well, what's their preferred communication style? And like, that's why they're not responsive, because you're not using that. And it's foreign to most people because they're used to the strict process of, well, this is how we communicate with clients. I say, yes, we should have a preferred method we use and say, this is how we're going to communicate with you. But if you don't respond, like, we do need to have another path forward. We need to be able to get the information and nudge them in the right direction, kind of training them to go
Yeah.
more towards ours if we can. But at the end of the day, if you're serving clients, like, the best thing you can do is meet them where they're at 100%.
Yeah, and I totally get you on, trying to nudge them. We have some clients that love to communicate through WhatsApp. Well, for our
Hmm.
account management team, that's kind of a burden on them. So, trying to find a different way than WhatsApp for
Yeah.
communication, so that we don't, and it really is trying to keep things centralized too.
Yeah.
Like Slack is great because you've got the history, your team can have access, or whoever needs to have access to it. It really is for the benefit of the client, but it can be hard for them to see that because they want to operate the way they want to operate.
Yeah. And sometimes it's texting them a link to the Slack and saying, hey, there are some messages, there are some messages here for you. You can check. Like, that works, because then they're like, oh yeah, I got to go do that. But then they'll respond in the Slack, and then it'll become more of a habit. A lot of it is just, if you want clients to adapt to your processes, you have to make it clear that's an expectation, number one. And then you also have to exhibit those behaviors and consistently follow your process too. That is way
Yes.
overlooked.
They're going to go to the easiest path for them.
Yes.
And if you're not enforcing the path, then they're going to go with the path they want.
Right. Employees and clients alike. Like, everyone will follow the path of least resistance for them to get the thing done. And the how does matter. You want to take the right path. But also, at the end of the day, for me, it's destination. As long as the objective is accomplished, we can always refine the process, but we have to make sure that the objective gets accomplished. And we acknowledge that there's different ways to accomplish it, but we have to find the best way and say that's the standard that we're going to use. And that's what we should be documenting. And I really
Mhm.
think that it can't be said enough that process is really what's going to drive value in a business. It's what's going to drive, frankly, your happiness, and your peace of mind, knowing that, no one's going to be texting you at dinner asking you how to do something on the computer that they need to.
Yeah, and then to think about all the wasted dollars that you're wasting because the person can't get their job done. You have a team of 10 people
Yep.
that are doing that with each other. That you could probably reduce your team by a person at that
Hmm.
time, within that time, because everybody else is working so much more efficiently. If they can get
Yeah.
their job done, you need less people. If they're all
Yeah.
trying to, hey, what's going on here? What do we need here? And they're just running in that chaos, that is costing you more money and more time. So you're texting at dinner because you've got to get back because you want this client to be taken care of. And your team is sitting there trying to figure out how to do their job.
Yeah. I mean, evidently, Elaine, I could talk about this with you all day because, like I said, I
We're
nerd out
just
on this stuff. I
tip of the
love this
iceberg.
stuff. Yeah, like I was excited to have a big team so I could start doing process documentation effectively. I was like, yes, we get to build the processes. But you mentioned, number one, you mentioned a quiz on project management tools. So I want you to tell folks about that again and where they can get in touch with you to learn more about Workday Ninja.
So our website's workdayninja.com. And if you scroll down to the resource section, there's a free tool. We call it the WMS Picker for Work Management System. And you just answer 12 questions. Super easy. It takes less than 2 minutes, and it will tell you which project management system is the best fit for what you're doing at your company. And then there's some other tools. So like we've been talking about automation on here. And if you put in, there's a separate quiz. If you put in which software tools you use, we'll send you a report immediately on 25 automations you could put in place right now.
Oh,
And
that's
so
so
super
cool.
handy to even figure out where to start, right? Because that's the big question. Where do I start? So that'll give you some
Yeah.
ideas. And then if anybody wants to connect with me, I'm very active on LinkedIn, Alane Boyd, and I'd love to hear from the listeners.
Amazing. And that's Alane, Alane Boyd. And then you'll connect with her on LinkedIn. Guys, take that quiz. That sounds really awesome. I'm going to go take that quiz on the software piece and find out what we're missing because that's really cool. And there's really no excuse not to get started. Go build the momentum. Go document one process today. Make that work for you and let us know what you're doing. Tag us, find Alane on LinkedIn. Let her know that you're implementing something that you learned today and any ideas that you shared. And also tag me on Instagram if you're on there at Shannon K. Weinstein. Alane, thanks for coming on the show today. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.